Hi, everyone. Welcome back to First Chapter Friday. This week is The Ickabog by J.K. Rowling. Yes, you heard that right. J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, has released a new book. Well, it's not a book yet. She's releasing it online, and it is called The Ickabog. And I'm so excited to bring it to you today and preview it for you. The Ickabog is, well, you're going to have to decide for yourself. The Ickabog, is it a creature? Is it a horrific monster? Is it even real, or is it just something that's been made up in this fictitious country you're going to learn about? So that's something you're going to have to discover as you read the story. The Ickabog is a fantasy book, kind of almost a fairy tale. It reads a little bit almost like some of the Disney movies that you maybe grew up with. So if you like fantasy or fairy tales, Disney movies, I think you're really going to enjoy this. And of course, if you loved Harry Potter, you will really like this. So anyway, let me tell you how this came about. J.K. Rowling is one of many authors around the world who has been releasing previously unseen works during this time when everyone is staying at home because of the coronavirus. And so this was a story that J.K. Rowling started writing 20 years ago when she was working on the Harry Potter books. She sort of worked on this Ickabog story in between each of the Harry Potter books. And as she was writing it between each book, she would read it in the evenings to her kids, kind of as a bedtime story. This is when her kids were younger. And she thought about it recently in the last couple of months since we've all been staying at home. It had been up in her attic in a box, and she thought about it and thought that maybe people might like to read it during this time when people are kind of bummed out that they can't hang out with their friends as much as they used to, and maybe this would bring some joy to people who really kind of needed it in this situation that we're in right now. And so this is being released every single day, a couple of chapters at a time between this week and July 10th, I think, about the middle of July. And so if you are interested, you get to read along each day as she reveals more and more of the story. And eventually, once she's released all the chapters, she's going to have it published as a book, and all the proceeds will go to COVID relief funds to help people who've struggled because of the COVID shutdowns. So it's a really fantastic opportunity, and I'm so excited to bring it to you today. The main character is a king named Fred the Fearless, and he has a couple of sidekicks who, kind of to go along with the Disney comparison I told you about before, are not quite the best friends that you might want to have, even though they try to come across that way. It is set in this little tiny kingdom of cornucopia, and the Ickabog is this supposed monster that people have been hearing stories about for generations. And the stories came out of a certain part of the kingdom in the north, and they've spread throughout all of the other parts of the kingdom. And so, in J.K. Rowling's own words, the Ickabog is a story about truth and about the abuse of power. And so, this is what some of these characters are going to be discovering on their journey throughout this story. So, I'm going to go ahead and show you where you can go to access all of the chapters, and then I'll preview the first chapter for you. So, let me go ahead and close this. So this is the website that you're going to go to if you want to read the rest of the story after I preview the chapter for you. And on this particular page that pops up, the most recently released chapters are the ones at the top. So you can see she's already released 2 or 3 chapters each day. So she's up to chapter 7. So we're just going to scroll down to the bottom portion of the page and click on chapter 1. This is where we're going to start. And then if you're interested in reading the rest, you can continue with the rest of the chapters that have been released on previous days. And then again, each day when you come back, you can read the newest chapters. Okay, so let's start with chapter 1, King Fred the Fearless. And one of the great things about this book or story is that it actually reads very quickly. The chapters are short. And so now that the weather has started getting nicer and more people are getting outside to enjoy the sun, there's less time maybe that you have for reading. So this is actually a really great way that she's releasing it, just a couple of chapters each day, because the chapters are short. You can read a couple chapters probably in just a few minutes, and then you can go on and go throughout the rest of your day and enjoy the sunshine, and then just come back for a few minutes each day. All right, so this is chapter 1, King Fred the Fearless. Once upon a time, there was a tiny country called Cornucopia, which had been ruled for centuries by a long line of fair-haired kings. The king at the time of which I write was called King Fred the Fearless. He'd announced the fearless bit himself on the morning of his coronation, partly because it sounded nice with Fred, you like that alliteration, but also because he'd once managed to catch and kill a wasp all by himself, if you didn't count the 5 footmen and the boot boy. King Fred the Fearless came to the throne on a huge wave of popularity. He had lovely yellow curls, fine sweeping mustaches, and looked magnificent in the tight breeches, velvet doublets, and ruffled shirts that rich men wore at the time. Fred was said to be generous, smiled and waved whenever anyone caught sight of him, and looked awfully handsome in the portraits that were distributed throughout the kingdom to be hung in town halls. The people of Cornucopia were most happy with their new king, and many thought he'd end up being even better at the job than his father, Richard the Righteous, whose teeth, though nobody had liked to mention it at the time, were rather crooked. King Fred was secretly relieved to find out how easy it was to rule Cornucopia. In fact, the country seemed to run itself. Nearly everybody had lots of food, the merchants made pots of gold, and Fred's advisors took care of any little problem that arose. All that was left for Fred to do was beam at his subjects whenever he went out in his carriage and go hunting 5 times a week with his 2 best friends, Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flapoon. Spittleworth and Flapoon had large estates of their own in the country, but they found it much cheaper and more amusing to live at the palace with the king, eating his food, hunting his stags, and making sure that the king didn't get too fond of any of the beautiful ladies at court. They had no wish to see Fred married, because a queen might spoil all their fun. For a time, Fred had seemed to rather like Lady Islanda, who was as dark and beautiful as Fred was fair and handsome. But Spittleworth had persuaded Fred that she was far too serious and bookish for the country to love her as queen. Fred didn't know that Lord Spittleworth had a grudge against Lady Islanda. He'd once asked her to marry him, but she'd turned him down. Lord Spittleworth was very thin, cunning, and clever. His friend Flapoon was ruddy-faced and so enormous that it required 6 men to heave him onto his massive chestnut horse. Though not as clever as Spittleworth, Flapoon was still far sharper than the king. Both lords were expert at flattery and pretending to be astonished by how good Fred was at everything, from writing to tiddlywinks. If Spittleworth had a particular talent, it was persuading the king to do things that suited Spittleworth. And if Flapoon had a gift, it was for convincing the king that nobody on earth was as loyal to the king as his 2 best friends. Fred thought Spittleworth and Flapoon were jolly good chaps. They urged him to hold fancy parties, elaborate picnics, and sumptuous banquets, because Cornucopia was famous, far beyond its borders, for its food. Each of its cities was known for a different kind, excuse me, and each was the very best in the world. The capital of Cornucopia, Shoeville, lay in the south of the country and was surrounded by acres of orchards, fields of shimmering golden wheat, and emerald green grass on which pure white dairy cows grazed. The cream, flour, and fruit produced by the farmers here was then given to the exceptional bakers of Shoeville, who made pastries. Think, if you please, of the most delicious cake or biscuit you've ever tasted. Well, let me tell you, they'd have been downright ashamed to serve that in Shoeville, unless a grown man's eyes filled with tears of pleasure as he bit into a Shoeville pastry. It was deemed a failure and never made again. The bakery windows of Shoeville were piled high with delicacies such as maidens' dreams, fairies' cradles, and the most famous of all, hopes of heaven, which were so exquisitely, painfully delicious that they were saved for special occasions, and everybody cried for joy as they ate them. King Porphyrio of neighboring Pluritania had already sent King Fred a letter, offering him the choice of any of his daughter's hands in marriage in exchange for a lifetime supply of hopes of heaven. But Spittleworth had advised Fred to laugh in the Puritanian ambassador's face. His daughters are nowhere near pretty enough to exchange for hopes of heaven, sire, said Spittleworth. To the north of Shoeville lay more green fields and clear, sparkling rivers, where jet black cows and happy pink pigs were raised. These in turn served the twin cities of Curdsburg and Baronstown, which were separated from each other by an arching stone bridge over the main river of Cornucopia, the Fluma, where brightly colored barges bore goods from one end of the kingdom to another. Curdsburg was famous for its cheeses, huge white wheels, dense orange cannonballs, big crumbly blue-veined barrels, and little baby cream cheeses, smoother than velvet. Baronstown was celebrated for its smoked and honey-roasted hams, its side of bacon, its spicy sausages, its melting beefsteaks, and its venison pies. The savory fumes rising from the chimneys of the red brick Baronstown stoves mingled with the odorous tang wafting from the doorways of the Curdsburg cheesemongers, and for 40 miles all around it was impossible not to salivate breathing in the delicious air. A few hours north of Curdsburg and Baronstown, you came upon acres of vineyards bearing grapes as large as eggs, each of them ripe and sweet and juicy. Journey onwards for the rest of the day, and you reached the granite city of Jeroboam, famous for its wines. They said of the Jeroboam air that you could get tipsy simply walking its streets. The best vintages changed hands for thousands upon thousands of gold coins, and the Jeroboam wine merchants were some of the richest men in the kingdom. But a little north of Jeroboam, a strange thing happened. It was as though the magically rich land of Cornucopia had exhausted itself by producing the best grass, the best fruit, and the best wheat in the world. Right at the northern tip came the place known as the marshlands, and the only things that grew there were some tasteless, rubbery mushrooms and thin, dry grass, only good enough to feed a few mangy sheep. The marshlanders who tended the sheep didn't have the sleek, well-rounded, well-dressed appearance of the citizens of Jeroboam, Baronstown, Curdsburg, or Shoeville. They were gaunt, which means thin, and ragged. Their poorly nourished sheep never fetched very good prices, either in Cornucopia or abroad, so very few marshlanders ever got to taste the delights of cornucopian wine, cheese, beef, or pastries. The most common dish in the marshlands was a greasy mutton broth made of those sheep who were too old to sell. The rest of Cornucopia found the marshlanders an odd bunch, surly, dirty, and ill-tempered. They had rough voices, which the other Cornucopians imitated, making them sound like hoarse old sheep. Jokes were made about their manners and their simplicity. As far as the rest of Cornucopia was concerned, the only memorable thing that had ever come out of the marshlands was the legend of the Ickabog. All right, that's the end of chapter 1. And so as you read, you can just keep clicking on the next chapter and you will learn more about the Ickabog, and you will be introduced to some more really interesting characters. Okay, so I'm just going to remind you again, this is the website that you can go to. And I hope you take advantage of this great opportunity. Remember, she's releasing 2 or 3 chapters every single day. So I hope you enjoy this, and hopefully I'll see you back again next week for our next First Chapter Friday. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.